In this video, we'll be talking about frame rates. We're going to cover what a frame rate is and what the most common frame rates you should be shooting at in different scenarios. So frame rate refers to how many still frames of video play in 1 second. The most common frame rates are 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. If you play back all of these frame rates in real time without slowing them down, you'll see that they look slightly different. I can't show you in this video what different frame rates look like because when you export a video, it only exports out one frame rate, but I can explain what it looks like, and then I can suggest a video for you to watch on YouTube that shows what I'm explaining. 24 frames per second is the most common frame rate that you will be shooting at, and I would suggest that you shoot everything at 24 frames per second unless you want to film in slow motion, but we'll get to that in a bit. Each camera also has the option to shoot at 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second, and I wouldn't recommend that you shoot at anything other than 24 frames per second unless you want to slow down that footage and shoot in slow motion. If you shoot in 30 and 60 frames per second and don't slow it down, your footage will look too smooth and not cinematic, because most movies out there are shot in 24 frames per second and our eyes are used to seeing that. And when we see 24 frames per second, we think of cinematic video. A lot of soap operas and TV shows are filmed at 30 frames per second, which makes their footage a bit smoother. So if you're going to be shooting TV shows or soap operas, then you can shoot in 30 frames per second. But if you shoot 60 frames per second without slowing it down, it will look way too smooth and not natural. So as a general rule of thumb, here are the guidelines that you should follow. Everything that you want to be played back in real time should be shot at 24 frames per second. If you want a tiny bit of slow motion to your footage, you can shoot in 30 frames per second and then slow the footage down to 80% speed in Premiere Pro, because 30 times 0.8 or 80% is 24. Here's an example of a video shot in 24 frames per second and the same motion shot at 30 frames per second with the second clip slowed down to 80%. So as you can see, it doesn't slow it down a ton, but it does just a little bit. And if you want a lot more slow motion, you can shoot your video in 60 frames per second and then slow that clip down to 40% speed in Premiere, because 60 times 0.4 or 40% is 24. This will stretch out your footage and make 1 second of footage stretch out to 2.5 seconds, making your footage slow motion. And this is what most weddings, real estate videos, and B-roll for music videos are shot in. Now, something to be cautious of is that if you're shooting something in 60 frames per second and you don't slow it down, your footage will look way too smooth because it's trying to pack all those frames into 1 second instead of slowing it down. If you want to see what 60 frames per second looks like without being slowed down, I recommend you go to YouTube and type in Peru 8K 60 FPS by Jacob and Katie Schwartz. The reason why they shoot and export these videos in 60 frames per second without slowing them down is because they sell a lot of these clips to stock footage companies like LG and Sharp that they can display on their 4K and 8K TVs, and they prefer to show off 60 frames per second. So check out that video and look closely at how smooth the footage is played back. It looks different, but you'd almost never see a movie played back at 60 frames per second. So an important tip is to make sure before you shoot anything to check your settings in your camera and make sure that your frame rate is set to the correct frame rate that you want to be shooting at. When I was just starting out, I realized that I forgot about that all the time, and I ended up shooting 60 frames per second for a ton of videos that I had intended to only shoot 24 frames per second. So learn from my mistakes so that you don't make the same mistakes when you're out there shooting. But that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.